Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call today's episode Astounding, 10 True Humanoid Encounters. It's amazing to me how many cases there are like this, and almost without exception, when people have these encounters, they're very surprised, and of course, astounded. That's why I gave it this title. And the 10 cases I've chosen for you today come from many different places across our planet, including England, France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, the United States, including Puerto Rico, and Argentina. The cases I've picked started in the 1950s all the way up to 2020, so some current cases as well, and of course involving a wide variety of humanoids. So we see the typical grays, but human-looking ETs as well, short little gnome-like beings, human-looking ETs, robotic humanoids, and more, but pretty much all humanoids. Some of these are single witness cases, some are multiple witness cases, and of course there is evidence for some of these cases, mostly in this compilation, electromagnetic effects and landing traces. Certainly some compelling cases and further evidence that we are not alone in this universe. So let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about today, I call the ETs and the Saucer. This is a single witness case, though it does involve apparent landing traces. It occurred on May 5th, 1954 in Fregim, Portugal. And it's a pretty interesting case. This case comes from researcher Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos. It was 2 p.m. on the afternoon of May 5, 1954, as 8-year-old Arnaldo Ribeiro de Freitas tended to some of his goats in the hills surrounding the small village of Fregim, Amarante, Portugal, where he lived. This area back then was far more rural than it is today. Lots of wilderness, thick with pine trees. And suddenly, he's out there herding his goats when he hears this strange sound, kind of like a whistling, that he said resembled a radio receiving static and interference. And it seemed to be coming from a dip in the terrain about 500 feet away from him. So he ran towards it to investigate. 10 seconds later, he reached this area and saw that the sound was coming from an object which was now flying off towards the nearby Tamego River. He watched it rise upwards from the ground, slowly revolving on its axis. It then reached a height of about 60 or 70 feet and accelerated at high speed towards the north, at which point it did emit a powerful hot wind. But meanwhile, Arnaldo noticed a second object, which was sitting in the middle of this dip in the terrain, only about 130 feet away. And it wasn't that large. It was about 4 feet tall, maybe 6 feet wide, shaped like a half sphere. He said it had a gray metallic circular base which went around the bottom of it, but the dome on top was transparent and the dome itself was topped by a brown colored turret. Now inside this craft he could see 2 humanoid figures which didn't look quite normal. They both had very large heads, large widely spaced eyes, just an opening for a mouth, and what looked like antennae on their heads. They both wore bright blue uniforms that reminded Arnaldo of armor. One of the beings appeared to be operating a lever-type device, while the other was staring directly at the witness. He says it looked to him like they were both sitting down, and he watched them in absolute surprise for about 20 seconds, which is a long time when you're seeing something like this so close up. Then, without warning, this object took off, and it was gone. Now later, checking out this area, he discovered that the location where the second craft had risen from the ground was barren of growth in an area of about 10 by 25 feet, and it would remain that way for at least the next 20 years. Nothing would grow there. In most ways, I would call that your typical UFO encounter with humanoids. What I like about it is the witness did get a very close-up look at these ETs, and also he clearly didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about this subject, so it's not likely that he made it up, and also considering the fact that there were apparent landing traces, that always lends an extra level of credibility to the account. It's a fascinating case of humanoids, and again occurring all over the world, as this next case illustrates. I like this case. I call it Another Alien Michelin Man. If I knew that there were so many cases like this, I probably would have done a singular episode on just Michelin Man type encounters, because there's a lot of them. And this one adds another to this long list of ETs that look like the Michelin Man. This one occurred in May of 1960 in Cadiz, Spain. I like it because the witness is very credible. He's a teacher, a professor, and he got a pretty darn good look at these really unusual humanoids. This case comes from Spanish researchers Antonio Ribera and Miguel Pero Garcia, both who interviewed the witness directly. And yeah, it's another addition to a long list of cases involving ETs that look like the classic Michelin Man. The witness in this case is Miguel Timmermans Ceballos. He's a teacher from Jerez de la Frontera in Cadiz, Spain. And it was one afternoon around 1 p.m. in May of 1960 that the witness, Miguel, was driving by motorcycle from Prado del Rey to his home in Jerez. Now he was in between the two small towns of Arcos de la Frontera and El Bosque. At the time of his encounter, this was a dirt road. It's now paved. But he was going up a short, steep hill when he saw a strange figure alongside the road, only about 500 feet ahead of him. And its appearance was so strikingly strange that Miguel knew instantly it was not normal, probably not human, because it was wearing this puffy, reddish suit composed of dozens of inflated rings, from its legs all the way up to its body and its arms as well. And as Miguel says, he was completely red, from head to foot, and suddenly appeared at the edge of the highway, rather tall, something like 2 meters or more, having trouble walking, and his walking was like a mechanical doll, that is to say, like a robot with stiff arms. So needless to say, he was shocked and surprised by its sudden appearance. He stopped his motorcycle and carefully observed the strange humanoid. He saw that it was walking along the edge of the road, and it took about 6 steps when suddenly another almost identical looking figure appeared and began to follow the first. Now this second figure had 2 major differences from the first. He was much shorter, just about 1 meter or less than 4 feet tall, and he also wore what looked like a single black boot on only one of its feet. So strange. Now Miguel could not see any facial features, but he could see that both these figures appeared to have trouble walking. As he watched, these 2 figures traversed the highway at an angle, and curious but cautious, Miguel debated with himself about whether he wanted to get closer. He said if he had another person with him, he would have, but being alone, he hesitated. So he waited until they crossed the road, and as these 2 figures disappeared into the brush on the other side, he finally decided to start up his motorcycle, which he did, and he drove up to where he had seen these 2 figures disappear. Unfortunately, by the time he arrived, they were no longer in view, and he estimates that he had seen them for about 30 seconds. He did look for evidence of their passing, footprints or anything like this, but there was nothing there. The whole encounter did leave him frightened and convinced that he had seen something that was not from this world. Having an encounter like that has got to be astounding, so I don't blame witnesses for not wanting to approach closer. As this witness said, he would have gotten closer if he had someone else with him, but he didn't. Unfortunately, there isn't any real physical evidence supporting his account, but given that he is a professor, I think this account is definitely worth attention. So, there's always another account where one leaves off. Just goes to show this is happening all over the world. And this next case shows that. This one comes from South River, New Jersey. It occurred on October 23rd, 1963. And I call this one, It Wasn't Anything Human. This is a single witness case involving a gentleman who saw ETs while driving down the road at night, but it's a good case, and what I especially like about it is it was very thoroughly investigated by researchers who were quite well experienced. It's rare that a case is investigated to the depth that this was, so I think you'll find it a really compelling case. This case was thoroughly researched by professional researchers Ted Bletcher, Roger Westcott, and his wife. And the main witness was initially anonymous, but we now know him to be Robert W. Smith. And it was around 11 p.m., again on October 23rd, 1963, as Robert drove from Boston, Massachusetts to Matawan, New Jersey. Strangely, he missed his turnoff on the Jersey Turnpike, exit 11, so he proceeded to the next exit, New Brunswick, got onto Route 18, and took what's now called County Road 615 towards Route 9. Coming around a sharp corner, he hit a straightaway, and he started to accelerate to about 50 or 60 miles per hour, and this is when he saw something he could hardly believe. And I'm just going to quote Robert extensively because he described this in such vivid detail. As Robert says, "Suddenly, I noticed something shining on the left side of the road. In an instant, 3 small, man-like creatures darted across the road. All 3 wore tight-fitting, silver-gray, one-piece suits. They were about 3 feet tall and moved faster than Homo sapiens is capable. Their legs, which were clearly outlined by the tight-fitting suits, appeared to move like pistons, as if unaffected by gravity. Now there was something very unusual about these figures. It was in the way they moved. These figures, 3 to 4 feet tall, did not run like a normal human being would. I would say that their movements were at least twice as fast as the fastest sprinter. And their leg movements, which I seem to remember mostly, the tremendous speed at which their legs moved, this was what disturbed me, the speed and the actual leg movements. It was almost like they fluttered across that road. They didn't run. The body movements did not look human to me. There was something very unusual about the movement of the legs that I just can't describe. I don't remember seeing any feet. The thing that sticks in my mind are those legs, those small legs, and how quickly they moved, almost like pistons, sort of spindly, but there was shape to them. I would say it was almost muscular. I could see a calf and a thigh. They were sort of luminous. Actually, it was like a silver gray. They seemed to glow once they hit the headlights. The beams reflected off them, but not before that. They crossed ahead of the car at a distance of perhaps 50 to 75 feet. It was a clear night. I think I had the high beams on, and I got a good look at them. But I could see no features except that they were two-legged, and they were faster than any living thing that I had ever seen, including animals. I've seen deer and all kinds of small game, and I never saw anything move that fast. So hardly able to believe what he had just seen, Robert decided to not slam on the brakes. And as he says, "My immediate reaction was to let my vehicle come to a halt without applying the brakes, as I did not want to stop too close to where they crossed the road. When my car stopped, I looked back but saw nothing. And after thinking about the situation, I decided not to investigate alone, as I was somewhat frightened. It sort of frightened me. I was going to go back and take a look at this, whatever I saw, but after considering the fact that it was a sort of desolate, lonely area, and I had not even a flashlight, I decided to forget about it and just go on about my business. I was actually afraid to go back and look. I hate to admit that, but man, I'll tell you, that's the only time in my life that I know I experienced fear. I actually was afraid. That made the hair stand up on my head, whatever I saw. I just didn't think they were normal, and so I didn't want to get involved in anything I didn't know about." So he did drive home, and upon arriving home he told his wife, who initially laughed, and told him it must have been children playing a prank. But Robert told her no, it wasn't anything human. So she absolutely believed him. Now later, after thinking about his encounter, Robert concluded that he must have seen extraterrestrials, and he wrote a letter to J. Allen Hynek, And this is what began the investigation. And Roberts said that these figures were, quote, the damnedest thing I ever saw. He said he would never forget it. And afterwards, he did admit that he regretted not going back to see if he could get a closer look at them. Can you imagine traveling down a rural road like that late at night, and what do you see? But 3 ET beings crossing the road right in front of you. This witness, as he said, does regret not stopping to go back and investigate, but I can hardly blame him because that has got to be a real surprise coming upon something like that. But to his credit, he did come forward, and I'm glad his case was investigated because there's a lot like it. A lot of cases of people driving along late at night and they see something they did not expect to see, and it changes their worldview forever. And here's another good example. I call this next case the floating humanoid of Cofico. This occurred on July 2nd, 1968 in a little town called Cofico in Argentina. And this is a really interesting case, particularly not only because the humanoid scene is pretty unusual, very tall and floating, but there were so many witnesses. A bunch of people in this small town saw activity on this night, and some of them saw the humanoid as well. July 2nd, 1968 turned out to be quite an eventful day for the numerous residents of the Cofico area. This is south of Salta, Argentina, and very near a mountain peak named the Peak of February 20. They all became witness to very unusual activity, but one of the first reports came from a young child by the name of Silvia Rosa Olmos. It was about 5 p.m. when she reported seeing, along with 2 other stonemasons who were working at her house, a glowing humanoid figure in the air. Now, 3 hours later, 3 policemen reported their sighting of a UFO over the nearby Portugal district. And it was apparently around the same time that there was another witness, Corina Robles, who stepped out of her backyard and saw this huge disc-shaped object which was sending down a bright beam of light. Seeing how unusual it was, she ran inside to get her mother, quickly ran back outside, and now saw that there was a huge robot-like figure, which she estimates was about 9 feet tall. This figure was suspended in the air, but very quickly started to move off. It slowly drifted away until it was lost behind some hills. Now, all in all, about 15 people reported seeing unusual activity, which had the entire neighborhood in an uproar, with some of the residents saying that all of this sounded too fantastic to believe. But events weren't over yet. The real clincher happened when a boy by the name of Francisco Emilia Sola, he's 14 years old, he experienced what was probably the closest and most extensive encounter of that day. He was at the local sporting club when he saw a UFO hovering over this same mountain peak. And it was then that he saw a 7 or 8 foot tall glowing figure hovering in the air very close to him, only about 10 to 15 feet away. He said it was strange because as he watched, this being started to spin in place, and then it went off again towards the top of this mountain peak. He immediately ran to the police, who were already overwhelmed with the recent reports. Now, this mini wave of sightings was later published in a few local newspapers, but otherwise remains virtually unknown, and as far as I know, has never been investigated by UFO researchers. Well, it does appear that that case was never officially investigated. Given that there were that many witnesses, it's hard to deny that something really unusual occurred in Cofico. It's a really compelling case when you have that many witnesses. And if you disbelieve that case, of course, there's always another one to take its place. This, I think, is really the best evidence we have. The fact that there are so many cases, far, far more, I'm sure, than the general public realizes. And here's another one, which I call the jaywalking aliens. Quite a few cases of people seeing ETs crossing the road in front of their car at night. Here's another example. This occurred on May 11, 1969 in Rockville, Virginia. And while this is in most respects a single witness case, in terms of the witness seeing humanoids, there are some corroborating witnesses to UFO activity in the area at that time, not to mention what appear to be landing traces involved with this humanoid sighting. This amazing case involves a series of unusual events which began on May 4, 1969, following a thunderstorm. This is when numerous residents in the Rockville area reported hearing an unusual sound in the sky. Herbert C. Claytor, his wife and son, all said that they saw this glowing, pulsating object, which was about the size of a car, hovering in the sky for a full hour. Now, 5 days later, 15 minutes before midnight on May 10th, it was 18-year-old Debbie Payne was being driven back to her home in Rockville after going on a date. Now, as they approached her house, she was startled to see a luminous oval-shaped object hovering very near her home. She watched as it flared in brightness and disappeared, but then reappeared twice before they reached her house. Now, the driver did not see the object, so Debbie didn't have any other witnesses. And that would have been the extent of it, except for 2 hours later and a half mile to the west, where another gentleman was about to experience one of the most puzzling and astounding events of his life. Mike Lukowicz, a 20-year-old student, was driving to his home at about 1:45 a.m., now May 11th. He had visited his girlfriend in nearby Rockville, and he just turned south onto Route 622. And was passing the Rockville General Store when he saw what he first thought were a couple of deer about 150 feet ahead of him crossing the road. But he realized almost immediately that these were not deer, and instead they appeared to be two small humanoid figures, each about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. They both wore large spherical helmets about the size of basketballs, with a large circular faceplate where the face would be. And these two figures stood motionless when the beams from Mike's car hit them. These faceplates reflected a pale green light, but as soon as these headlights hit him, almost immediately they scuttled and scrambled across the road to the left side, climbing up a 4-foot-tall embankment, which was overgrown with weeds and vines and poison ivy and other plants, and escaped into a field of barley where they disappeared. So he watched this, and as soon as they disappeared, at that very moment, a third figure dashed across the road, again from right to left, and was now only 75 feet ahead of Mike's car. This humanoid followed the same route as the others, only per Mike, it moved much faster. He said all three figures were dressed in light brown coveralls, which were loose-fitting and baggy around the legs, but fit snugly around the ankles. So they disappeared quite quickly. It was a pretty brief sighting, but he saw it close enough, and he was so shaken by the encounter that he told nobody at first. He thought about it all day, but later decided to report the experience, and he returned with 3 other people to the site, where they did in fact find a trail in the poison ivy and honeysuckle, which led to a path that went right through the barley. Cases like these always make me wonder, what are these ETs up to? It's clear we are seeing just a portion of what's going on behind the scenes, because they're coming down, they're doing things, and they're taking off, and we don't hear about it. We only, of course, hear about what witnesses are able to see. So who knows, maybe they were there to pick plants or pick somebody up. Hard to say, it's pure speculation. But they were clearly there for a reason, and apparently there for a while because there were so many sightings in that area at that time. And now we move to another case. This one is really interesting. It is a multiple witness case. It's got some really compelling landing trace evidence as well. I call this one the dumbbell ETs. I gave it that title because the shape of the object was described as dumbbell shaped. Very unusual. This could be a matter of perspective. Hard to say for sure. It occurred on October 24, 1976 in Habling, France. And I think you'll find it a very compelling case. This case received considerable attention from investigators and was published in both publications Lumière dans la nuit and Hypotheses extraterrestres. The primary witness is Romeo Lucarelli, and it was around 10:30 p.m. on the evening of October 24, 1976, and Romeo and his young daughter were returning from the village of Hestroff, France, to their home in Habling. They had just visited some friends and now were going home. They had driven about a half mile when he noticed two odd-looking lights ahead of him. Now these were off in the distance, and he thought at first it might be a car parked up on a hill. He didn't think too much of it. He continued to drive normally, but kept his eye on these lights. And as he got closer, he realized that this wasn't a car. These lights were actually a craft of some kind hovering in the air. And as he watched, it actually zigzagged from the right side of the road to the left, and he could see that, yes, this was a large craft, about 50 feet long, shaped kind of like a dumbbell, two circles with a rectangular structure in the center. Now it was flashing a multitude of colored lights. And as Romeo says, when I started to go up the road, I saw that the machine was hanging there and not moving. So getting close to it, he now could see that this was in fact a UFO. He was absolutely amazed. As he says, I never would have thought that it would happen to me. Frankly, I was afraid. Now his young daughter was sleeping at the time, so he quickly woke her up, told her to hang on tight as he was going to have to drive real fast. And as Romeo says, at the moment when I passed by them, they were still hanging about 100 meters high and about 100 to 150 meters on the left side. Now they began to follow me. So this really frightened him, and he continued to race down the road until he reached a forested area where he thought he might have some protection. As he says, there I slowed down. I said to myself that maybe here I will be calmer and they can't land because of the trees, because I immediately imagined that they were looking for something. So I slowed down, maybe to 30 or 40 an hour. And a few seconds later, I started again at full speed. And then, there they come, out of the forest. It really looked like they were following me. And then they started to descend with their aircraft. Now it was then that Romeo and his daughter could both see two figures inside who appeared to be maneuvering to control their strange craft. As Romeo says in his own words, they were leaning forward, and then naturally as I saw that, I started flashing my headlights, because I was driving quite fast. And then I saw that they were coming towards me, and stood in front of me. I then saw, in the middle of the device, a screen lit very dimly by an orange light which came from inside the machine. And immediately after this light, two silhouettes appeared in this rectangle, as if to look at me. I understood that they wanted to land in front of me, but they didn't have the opportunity because then there was the village. So he was approaching his home at this point. He said one of the figures appeared to be standing. The other was sitting down in what looked like some kind of chair. Romeo's daughter also observed this, confirmed it with investigators. They both saw that the one sitting in the armchair appeared to be maneuvering the craft using a thin stick with a sort of blue ball at the end of it. Now she did say that one of the figures appeared to have dark hair and a beard. Romeo did not notice this. He, at this point, of course, was approaching the village and his house, and as he did, this object shot away, and he told himself that he was now free of them, and he pulled into his driveway. His wife came out to greet him as she normally would, and it was at this same moment that the UFO in fact returned and now was hovering not far above their garage. And as Romeo said to his wife, "There's the machine there. It followed me. I was all trembling and all white," he said. Now his wife, seeing this thing, said, "It's not possible." And Romeo replied, "Yes, it followed me up here." And I'll just let Romeo describe what happened next. As Romeo says, "So she looked up for a minute or two with me, and then I said, go get the binoculars so I can see what it is up close. So she comes in, takes the binoculars. At the same time as she came out, the machine began to move forward very slowly. Then I took the binoculars. While I was about to fix on the device, they turned off the light, and we just heard a little noise, a rather dull hum. It was a noise I could not explain to you. So this was a weird noise that he had never heard before. But as they watched, this object then flashed a big white light in the center of it, and it moved slowly off into the distance. So the next day, he decides he's going to return to the field where he first saw this object. And he did in fact find 3 landing traces, which were very unusual. They were sort of composed of 2 tangential double circles of crushed grass, each about 50 feet wide. It looked to him like the craft had slid along the ground before coming to a rest. Now, it was just a few weeks later that Romeo did speak with UFO researchers. They could see that he was still quite shaken up by the experience. They went with him to the location where this object was first seen, and they saw the landing traces as well. They spoke with the police, who confirmed that Romeo was intelligent and well-balanced, and the police did a little bit of an investigation. They did confirm that Romeo and his wife and daughter did apparently see something, but they did try to explain away the sighting. They said that perhaps Romeo had seen a tractor on a hill, and that the figures were actually 2 men in the transparent tractor cabin, because it turns out there was a tractor in the area at the time. But they apparently just ignored Romeo's description of the multicolored lights, the fact that this object was hovering in the sky, the fact that it followed him home, that it was making an unusual low buzzing noise, that it disappeared and reappeared and hovered over the garage, and so forth. So that appears to be a pretty ridiculous debunking explanation, and it sounds like a really well-confirmed sighting of a UFO and humanoids. I have to say, that made me laugh when the police tried to explain this case away as a tractor being reflected into the sky, which is ridiculous considering that the husband and the wife and the daughter all saw this thing hovering right over their garage. It followed them home. They got a very clear look at it. Clearly not a tractor. And the police themselves said that the witness is an intelligent and honest person. But it's a good case, thoroughly researched, landing traces as well that have yet to be explained. So it's hard to dismiss this case, which I think is why it's worthy of attention and certainly being included in this little compilation. And now we move to another really compelling case. I call this one, It Didn't Seem Like a Normal Person. This is in most respects a single witness case, though there were other people there. They were apparently government folks. This is an interesting case because it points towards these craft being reverse engineered. So that alone is very important. People do need to know that we have, to some extent, gotten our hands on ET technology, the military has, and are reverse engineering it. So not everything people see in the sky is necessarily ET. You can make up your own mind about this one. It's got some really interesting elements to it that I think point towards at least one of these craft being truly ET. It occurred on January 21st, 1977 in Camuy, Puerto Rico. A lot of stuff going on there that's quite unusual. It's a really interesting case. This case comes from longtime and prolific researcher Jorge Martin, and it does involve a single witness by the name of Juan Pedro Hernandez. It was 1:30 a.m. on the evening of January 21st, 1977, as Juan was driving from Camuy to Mayagüez in Puerto Rico when he noticed an unusually brilliant star-like object, which he could see clearly wasn't a star, because suddenly it started to descend towards him. He had just crossed over the bridge over the Camuy River when he saw that this light was now no more than a half-mile away. And what had been a brilliant white light now changed to a vivid violet color and then to turquoise blue. And he could see now it wasn't just a light, but in fact a solid craft. Very large, about 800 feet wide and 500 feet long. He got out of his car to take a real close look at it, and as Juan says, it was vast, enormous. It was triangular and was now down to a height of about 80 to 100 feet above me. I could see lights on it, a row of iridescent lights, as well as others that were changing color all of the time in sequence: red, yellow, blue, white. On top it had a cupola, inside of which I could see the silhouette of a person. And it didn't seem like a normal person, but tall, slender, with a strangely shaped head, like a pear, large in the upper part and small below at the jaws. The light was strong enough for me to see his eyes, which were big and dark. So this sounds very much like a gray. Juan was curious but frightened, and his emotions became stronger when this craft did something that affected him personally. As Juan says, suddenly from the top part, the cupola, came a beam of light that shone on me. It wasn't like the light of a torch, a flashlight, which becomes dispersed. As it came down gradually, it was controlled and keeping its shape, contained within itself. And it enveloped me. I was still standing there looking at the being in the cupola, and now I felt a sensation of vast peace, a tranquility, such as I have never known before. So clearly this is not a normal light. This beam of light remained on him for a full 3 minutes, he estimates. Now he got a good look at the bottom of the craft, and he saw what looked like 6 to 8 blades moving, rotating very slowly. No sound whatsoever was audible. This craft then withdrew the beam of light from him, and it started to move slowly away. Now Juan, very interested, hopped back into his car and tried to follow it. But he hadn't gone more than 20 feet when the road ahead of him was blocked by a black van with darkened windows. So Juan came out of his car, walked up, and asked why the road was blocked. A man dressed totally in black came out, and Juan asked him if he was seeing what Juan had seen. And the man replied enigmatically, "If you're seeing it or not seeing it is of no interest to me." And he then told Juan threateningly to stop following it or else something might happen to him. But Juan was not to be deterred, and the man shouted again at him, "You aren't going to follow it, and that's that." But still undeterred, Juan walked up to the van, peered directly inside, and he could see 3 other men, all dressed in black, and in the back of this van he saw what looked like radar equipment, which he was familiar with. He could see the screens and what apparently were blips on the screen showing this UFO and what looked like 2 other craft approaching. And sure enough, right on cue, 2 other craft did in fact appear. Now these looked very much like the first one he had just seen, which shone a beam of light on him, except these craft were very noisy. The first craft, which was still visible a short distance away, now lit up with a brilliant violet light, which obscured the fact that it was a craft. It now appeared to be just a ball of violet light, and it darted upwards at super high speed, in only seconds becoming a tiny point of light among the stars. Now when this happened, the other 2 craft veered off, and per Juan, they were leaving a trail of smoke. So Juan believes that this first craft was actually extraterrestrial, piloted by ETs, but the other 2, he thinks, were probably reverse-engineered military craft. And as Juan says, they are trying to present themselves to the public as being them, the ETs, and trying to show the public that those other folk, the supposed extraterrestrials, are bad, coming to devour us, to inflict damage, all in order to create a false image of what those other personages, or whatever they are, can be. I have to give kudos to Juan for having the courage not only to report his sighting, but to really confront these government agents, apparent government agents, in the way that he did. I also found it really interesting how he describes when he was struck by this beam of light, he felt this incredible peace and tranquility. This is a detail I've heard in many other accounts, and I think points towards that being an actual ET craft. But the other ones, no, they sound like government reverse engineered to me. That's certainly what the witness thought. I found his interpretation of what's going on here very interesting because there is a lot of talk about false flag and governments pushing a ET invasion, portraying ETs as malevolent. So you can make up your own minds about it, but I thought it was an important case. And now we move to another one, which is super fascinating to me. I call this one the UFO gnome. The description of the ETs in this case is really interesting because it in some ways parallels the many reports we have of fairies and gnomes and elves and other little people all across the world. This is actually a series of events which occurred through March and June of 1978 in Via Mar di Sapri in Italy, and it is a multiple witness case. It does have landing traces. It also has electromagnetic effects. There's a lot to, I think, confirm the validity of this case. This very unusual case comes from Italian researcher Umberto Tellerico and Maurizio Verga. It appeared in numerous publications, and it involves numerous strange events over a period of months, occurring primarily to 26-year-old Constantina Imbibo. But it does also involve other witnesses and some very interesting evidence. Events began at around 5:30 p.m. starting on March 20, 1978, when Constantina and her husband observed a white conical object which appeared to have orange horizontal bands and was hovering just above the ground not far from their home in Via Mar di Sapri. This is outside of Salerno, Italy. And as they watched, this object swung around a little bit, then disappeared behind some trees and was gone. But it was just 1 week later, on March 27, 1978, that they were in their house when suddenly all the lights went out for no apparent reason. A few minutes later, they came back on, and acting on her intuition, Constantina rushed outside, and sure enough, she saw this dome-shaped object emitting a pulsating white light underneath it. After just a few moments, this object moved downwards and seemed to disappear towards the ground. And after it was gone, it left this strange fog or mist, which very quickly dissipated. The events weren't over yet. Something really interesting was about to happen because 1 month later, on April 25, 1978, events came to a climax when Constantina saw a huge orange sphere hovering above the trees behind her house. Now she grabbed a camera and tried to take a picture, but she was too frightened. She wasn't able to do it. And as she watched, this sphere appeared to shrink down to a diameter of 4 to 5 feet. When she first saw it, it was almost the size of a house, she says. But once it shrank down, she says a humanoid figure came out of it. And it was strange. In fact, this figure reminded her of a gnome in a number of ways. His face looked mostly human, but it was very bright, had very thin lips. He also noticed that there was a, quote, conical structure, or what looked like a hat, on its head. And he was wearing this weird orange suit and black boots. And as Constantina watched, this gnome-like figure looked all around, darting its head back and forth, making slight movements, and then it started to move in this weird hopping around. She said it had very thin limbs, and was hopping in this way that reminded her again of a gnome. Meanwhile, this sphere continued to shrink until it completely disappeared. This little being continued to hop around, at one point coming as close as 150 feet to Constantina, and it looked right at her. So at this point she became quite frightened and called her husband. Immediately the being squatted behind a truck, quote, disappearing in a slight fog, which persisted a few seconds. So unfortunately, her husband did not come out in time to see this gnome-like being. But events weren't quite over yet. Just over 1 month later, on June 9, 1978, Konstantina saw 3 strangely shaped objects which were hovering very close to the ground. And on impulse, she set out a telepathic message, thinking to herself, "If you hear me, disappear." She looked again, and the objects were gone. But the next day, she and her husband and others did go out to this area, and they saw that the grass where one of these objects had been was now yellowed, and it was in the same shape of the object itself. Later that month, Konstantina had another sighting. She said she saw no less than 15 disc-shaped objects descend from the sky, land very quickly on a nearby hill, and then take off, again leaving this fog which dissipated quickly. She reported also seeing smaller blue orbs about a half-foot in diameter. She said on one occasion she saw one of these orbs which actually touched the branch of an olive tree, causing the leaves to shrivel and dry up. And that's the extent of it. But perhaps related to Konstantina's UFO gnome-like being is this remarkably similar humanoid sighting which occurred, get this, only 2 days earlier on April 23, 1978. This is also in Italy, but in a town of Cerreto, which is to the north, not far in terms of how fast a UFO can fly. Now this case was investigated by researcher Moreno Tambellini, and on that evening, numerous witnesses reported seeing a V formation of glowing objects fly over the city. But it was later that same evening, Cesarina Campioni was getting ready for bed when she noticed a strange glowing light in her backyard. Looking outside to investigate, she saw 2 3-foot-tall figures which were wearing shiny metallic, loose-fitting clothes, an outfit that covered their entire body. She said that they had a dark belt around their waists and also wore sort of a pointy, cone-shaped hat or helmet with a visor where the face would be. So very much like what the previous witness Konstantina saw. Now Cesarina's curiosity turned to fear when she heard these weird beings speaking out loud with this sort of guttural, metallic-sounding, unintelligible language. And she says they also moved around with strange leaps and bounds, very much like Konstantina had described. So they bounded around and finally disappeared into a nearby olive grove. Such a weird case, that one. It's amazing that the witnesses described these ETs, apparent ETs, in such similar detail, as being short and having these pointed hats and bouncing around like gnomes. Definitely makes you wonder about the earlier reports throughout history of other little people. Perhaps these were misinterpreted as being gnomes or fairies when in fact they were ETs. Or perhaps there's something else going on here. Hard to say, but I think this is why research is so important, because it will hopefully lead to the truth coming out and further clarification on what is going on here on planet Earth. Now let's move to the next case, which is incredibly interesting. I like this one. It's another example of an ET crossing the road in front of a car at night. So again, that seems to be a pattern we see quite often. I call this one an 8-foot-tall gray. It certainly seems like this is what the witness is describing. This one is fairly recent, occurring on July 31st, 2018, just north of Mount Vernon in Ohio. And it's a good case. Although it is a single witness case, the witness himself is a trained observer, a military officer, has a top secret clearance. I think this makes him a good witness. The case was also researched by an experienced MUFON field investigator. So he himself interviewed the witness firsthand, went to the site. So it looks like this is an absolutely legitimate case. But wow, what an unusually described humanoid. This very bizarre humanoid sighting was researched by Ohio-based Mutual UFO Network field investigator Ron McGlone. The witness reported his case to MUFON. He's requested anonymity, But he says that on the evening of July 31st, 2018, he was driving along Ohio State Route 13, which is a couple of miles north of Mount Vernon in Ohio, when he saw what he first thought was a deer walking across the road. But he quickly realized this could not be a deer, as it was walking upright, and it was clearly bipedal. And in fact, he said that this being had a, quote, a tall, slender body, arms and legs small in diameter, hands and feet that looked oversized for its body proportion, a small neck with an oval, elongated head. He further described this being as having a dark tan or brownish skin, a bald head, no visible body hair, black eyes, no apparent nose, a small mouth, and 4 fingers on each hand. But most amazing was that this figure was somewhere between 7 to 8 feet tall. He said he watched it come out of a cornfield, walk across the highway, and actually traverse the whole width of the highway in only 2 or 3 strides. And he said that it moved very quickly at, quote, a tremendous rate of speed and off into a soybean field. And I'll just let the witness describe this in his own words, as he says, I noticed the creature in my headlights from 50 to 75 feet away as I was traveling at a rate of 55 to 60 miles per hour. As it came out of the cornfield, I immediately let off the accelerator. The creature slightly turned its head towards my vehicle's headlights, and I saw the creature's black eyes and small mouth just open slightly as it continued to cross the road. I was in total shock, and I thought I should check it out at first. But then I thought for a second, and being uncertain of what I may have just seen, I had better get out of the area. I lost sight of the entity due to darkness. Although he only saw this for a few moments, he was absolutely convinced he saw something extraterrestrial. There was no way this thing was human, given its appearance. So he reported this encounter to the Mutual UFO Network, and he was put in touch with field investigator Ron McGlone, who conducted an interview, returned to the sighting location with the witness to look for any evidence. Unfortunately, no evidence was found, but the researcher Ron McGlone did say that the witness appeared to be a, quote, credible witness. And in fact, it turns out the witness is a 24-year USAF retired aircrew veteran who has a top secret clearance. So clearly a good witness. And in his report to MUFON, he wrote, would somebody please advise me on what I have seen, because it still and truly frightened me. When people talk about grays, yeah, they usually say, oh, maybe 3 feet, 4, 5 feet, even 6 feet. I've heard 7 feet as well, but it's rare that you get one 7 or 8 feet tall. There are cases, they're somewhat of outliers, but I don't know, it's a really unusual case. This guy did not see a craft. That itself, again, is not unusual. As we've seen in this compilation, there's a number of cases of people seeing these weird humanoids, and no UFO, no craft was seen. So, hard to say what exactly is going on here. Maybe the UFO is off there in the distance. We don't know. But there's always another case, and here's the last one in this little collection, which is really compelling. I was a bit on the fence about this one, but the more I investigated it, the more it seemed absolutely credible to me. I like it because this gentleman actually did capture photographs of the UFO he saw. Not the humanoid, unfortunately. But wow, it's a really bizarre case and very recent. I call this one, I Saw Something I Will Never Forget. This occurred on July 16, 2020, not that long ago, in Warwick, England. And the poor witness, while he did have the courage to come forward, suffered a lot of disbelief and ridicule about it. His case did get national headlines. I'm really glad he did come forward. We don't hear about the huge majority of cases like this, so kudos to him for coming forward and sharing his story. The witness in this remarkable case is a young man by the name of Paul Fregim. He's 26 years old at the time of his encounter, and it was 5 a.m. on July 16, 2020, as Paul was riding his bicycle to his home in Warwick. This is in West Midlands, England. He had just worked a 12-hour-long night shift at his job in a dog food factory. And he, of course, had no idea that he was about to have an experience that would earn national headlines and alter the course of his life forever. And it started with a simple UFO sighting. As Paul says in his own words, it was a glowing orange sphere just hovering on the horizon. At first, I thought it must be Venus or a satellite, but it seemed to be much closer than either of these things. I stopped on my way to take some photos. The object looked a fair bit bigger in person than is visible in the photos. This is when the object started to move around and rotate in shape. I could see it was circular, with a part sticking out from the main body. When this started, I got chills down my back and felt like there was something wrong here. I hurried on my way home. As I kept cycling, I could swear the object was moving along my course, but I just told myself it must be some kind of optical illusion. Now, Paul's encounter was now about to move from a simple sighting, a close encounter of the first kind, to direct contact with an alien entity, a close encounter of the third kind. Now, his path on his bicycle now took him to a wooded area known as Oakwood and Blacklow Spinney. This is a Warwickshire Wildlife Trust area. And as Paul says in his own words, I entered a wooded area and lost sight of the object through the trees. Usually at this time of the morning, there is a chorus of bird song and insects, but the woods were dead silent. As I cycled down the path, I came around a bend, and I saw something I will never forget. Standing a few meters ahead is what I can only describe as a humanoid praying mantis. This thing was at least 7 feet tall, light green, with a triangular head and big black oval eyes. It had all the features of a mantis, but stood on 2 legs and had a somehow human-like shape about it. I was completely frozen with fear. For what felt like an age, but was probably only a few seconds, I stared into this creature's eyes, and it stared back. I felt like it could read my mind, and I could read its. My fear was replaced with completely alien thoughts of utter hatred and evil I felt projected from this thing. I suddenly snapped out of this hypnotic kind of state, and it made a step back as if it was going to pounce on me. It sounds crazy, but I felt I could sense its feelings towards me, and it was just like pure alien hatred. You know when you're watching a David Attenborough documentary and you see a spider eating a fly and just a malevolent sense of evil? So this is what Paul sensed. He was actually shaking with fear. He began to cry, but he was able to break free from this mental hypnotic grip, at which point this creature apparently disappeared. Paul raced home. He was unharmed, but thoroughly emotionally traumatized. Physically, he was fine. But following this, he began having a lot of trouble sleeping at night. He was having nightmares. He did decide to share his experience with his fellow co-employees at work. This might have been a mistake because they ridiculed him mercilessly, actually began to call him the Mantis Man of Warwick. It got so bad he actually had to quit his job. Now finally, Paul did decide to share his story with the media. Despite those who would disbelieve and ridicule him, Paul insists that this incident truly did take place, that he was not drinking or on drugs, and he does have the photographs to prove that he did see something. Now he hopes that someone else will come forward and confirm that they saw a UFO in that area on that night. That's one of the reasons he came forward. So yeah, Paul, although he remains alone with this story, he's sticking to it. And it's certainly sticking to him because, yeah, this did get national headlines. It was published in the newspaper. And he says that for him, the alien invasion has already begun because he's still having nightmares about being on board a craft, being examined not only by praying mantis, but short little grays. Now, if he's had any prior encounters or anything after this, he's apparently learned to keep quiet about it, and who can blame him? I think you'll agree that's a pretty interesting event. And what's fascinating about it is although he felt that this was not really a benevolent encounter, nothing actually happened to him. He wasn't harmed. He was just thoroughly frightened by the encounter. Unless, of course, there was missing time, which is a possibility, given that he's had dreams of being on board following this experience. But the poor guy, I mean, the ridicule he suffered is absolutely unfair. With people saying such things as he's eaten too much dog food, or he's on drugs, or he just got too tired and dreamt up the whole thing. I mean, he suffered the full range of ridicule, which really has no place in UFO research, as J. Allen Hynek himself said. But certainly a case that's worthy of attention. So that's it for today. I want to thank you all for watching. I truly appreciate it. I find this subject endlessly fascinating. There are so many humanoid accounts. We've got so much we can learn about them, about what is out there in the universe, and really about ourselves, how we react to something that's unknown, and many other things these cases definitely do have to teach us. So that's it for today. Humanoids from all over the world, reaching back decades to pretty much the present day. Those who are skeptical, well, I understand it. I was once a skeptic, but I hadn't examined the evidence. And I'm convinced if anyone has the courage to examine the evidence objectively, not through the lens of their own belief system, but actually taking a look at the evidence and trying to account for it, you will only come away convinced that something very profound is going on here. So thanks again. That's it for now. I will see you next week. But until then, keep searching for answers. They're out there. Keep searching for the truth. It's up to you to find it. But most important of all, keep having fun. Because if you're not having fun, what are you doing? See you next time, guys. Bye.